And I can see the people entering the room. I just want to let the audience know that we'll start in about 2 minutes. All right, what do you say we get started? We got quite a few people in now. So good morning and welcome to the Arizona Capital Times Morning Scoop. You know, there's been a lot of attention paid lately to housing and homelessness here in Arizona, and we're going to add an hour of discussion today to that today. And I want to thank everyone in the audience for joining. I'm Gary Grotto, the executive editor of the Arizona Capital Times, and I'll be moderating this important discussion that is sponsored by Home Matters and Valley Leadership. Home Matters is an initiative focused on a new generation of affordable housing, connected communities, and healthier individuals, families, and economies. Home Matters' mission is to build awareness and raise funds for more affordable homes and thriving communities across the nation. Our other sponsor is Valley Leadership. Valley Leadership is a 501c3 that gives Arizonans the tools to solve challenges together by empowering a broad spectrum of Arizonans to lead through its learning opportunities and mobilizing them to make a difference in our state's most pressing issues. I want to thank both of our sponsors for helping us put this together today. And now, before I introduce the panel, I want to introduce Dave Brown. He's the Valley Leadership CEO. So, Dave, can you tell us a little bit about what we're going to talk about today?
Yes, thank you, Gary, and good morning and welcome, everyone. I know housing and homelessness are two very important topics to pressing issues facing Arizona, not just here in Metro Phoenix, but across the state. So appreciate everyone coming out early in the morning on a Wednesday to learn more about how we can address that. And from three panelists who each approach it in different ways, and some exciting things we're going to talk about today. Valley Leadership has a program called the Impact Maker. We have leaders across the state working on housing and homelessness in different ways. And in particular, using this campaign here, Home is Where It All Starts, to get more people to understand the importance of home and what they can do to help make sure home is possible for every Arizonan. So excited to have the three panelists here. We hope you leave in the next hour with some things to do. We hope you leave inspired. We hope you leave not overwhelmed. I know housing is a big issue and very complicated, but we hope that hearing from these three panelists, you'll leave with some hope that things can be done. It's probably going to be a lot of little things, but we hope that you leave the program today feeling good about what we can do. So thank you, Gary. Thank you, Dax, Jim, and Denise for sharing your time with us today.
All right. Thank you, Dave. And now to introduce you to the people everyone has come here to hear and see. Our first panelist is Denise Resnick. Denise is the founder and president CEO of First Place Arizona, a nonprofit organization established in 2012 with the goal of setting new standards for supportive community development with residential options and resources for adults with autism and other neurodiversities. Good morning, Denise, and welcome to the Morning Scoop.
Good morning. Very glad to be here, and also wanted to recognize that I'm a proud mother of a 32-year-old son with autism, living in the property behind me.
All right, well, thank you and good morning. So our next panelist is Dax Howard, and Dax is a principal at Magalos Capital. Good morning, Dax, and did I pronounce that correctly? I should have asked you before we got on the...
No, did a pretty good job. Thank you guys for having me.
Thank you.
I'm excited to be here.
And our last panelist is Jim Rounds, president of Rounds Consulting Group. Jim regularly provides advice to policymakers at Arizona State Capitol, to mayors throughout the state, as well as city council members, county board members, and other public and private sector leaders in the community. Good morning and welcome, Jim.
Morning. Thanks for having me.
Now, before we jump into our conversation, I want to let the audience know that we have the chat open, and it's where you can submit your questions for the panel. I'll be monitoring the chat, and I'll get to as many questions from the audience as time permits. I just ask the audience to use the chat only for questions and not use it for talking amongst yourselves, and to please keep it civil. All right, so housing and homelessness has been in the news a lot lately, and what we've been reading, hearing, seeing is the general consensus is our housing shortage has reached a crisis point. And of course, last week, the governor vetoed a bipartisan bill that, in a nutshell, would have called for higher densities and smaller lots, and allowed people to buy starter homes. So the conflict of the storyline was the cities against the home builders, and that's typically what you see whenever there's housing bills at the legislature. But housing is more complex than that you're going to learn today. So I'd like to throw it first to Jim, the economist. Can you tell us where we're at right now and how we got here?
Sure. So we can tie a lot of this back to the last two very unusual recessions. Leading up to the Great Recession, we overbuilt, but then we went through a long period of underbuilding. So the problem was slowly getting worse over time, but it wasn't at a point where we were going to see that economic shock yet. When we went through the COVID recession, we really had an impact on, it primarily impacted those of lower income. So let's say you made less than $40,000 a year, you had more than a 25% chance of losing your job. If you made about $150,000 a year because of all the extra incentives and the extra money in the economy, you actually did quite well financially getting through COVID. So it was just a very unusual period that threw us out of balance. And the thing about economics, and this is why I'm optimistic, but I'm also a little concerned, is that things tend to get back to normal. We have two ways where housing prices are going to come back down. One is going to be we do nothing, and that means that housing prices are going to come down because we're not competitive with our neighbors and we're going to have slower economic growth. The other way is to be proactive and try to grow, but make sure that we can grow and increase all the different inputs that allows a community to grow, a state to grow. And one of those is going to be housing. This is a major economic development opportunity, but also a risk right now.
And how is it a risk?
Well, we have to come up with solutions because we're competitive in terms of economic development with a lot of other communities, but it doesn't take much in terms of a change in public policy to throw us from being number one to number third. And there's that old movie where Will Ferrell says, if you're not first, you're last. If you're not first on a business location, it doesn't matter if you're second, you don't get the business location. But affordability used to be something that we promote. Now we can't promote it. Now we have to explain how we're going to find housing for the workers that are coming in. And we've been seeing explosive growth in higher wage jobs. Our per capita personal income numbers are going up, but we have to be able to find housing for those. And it'll be different in the Phoenix area versus an area up north versus an area down south. We have to come up with some very clever solutions. Some of it's going to be spending money. Some of it's going to have to be a change in public policy.
All righty. Well, thank you. Thank you, Jim. So real quickly, Denise and Dax, tell us what your organizations do and what they're doing to address this crisis. Let's start with Denise.
Yeah, First Place Arizona is a residential and community developer. We're a charitable nonprofit, and what we're doing is to address a segment of the population that is part of the housing crisis, and also a growing population that's experiencing displacement and homelessness. The incidence of autism today is about 1 in 36. Kids are growing up, and after high school, it's a slippery slope. More than 1.8 million adults with autism across the country are living with caregivers over the age of 60, like me. And we are receiving at an increasing rate more calls from our collaborating charitable nonprofits like CAS and St. Vincent's and many others about individuals that have autism that are experiencing homelessness. What we are wanting to do and what we are doing is getting to those individuals earlier. And what we're attempting to do is to truly fuel a new wave of housing and community development for a population that needs supportive housing. And it's really important that when we have these conversations about housing, that we think about it like a portfolio. There's temporary and permanent housing, there's workforce housing, there's supportive housing. Not everybody needs the same thing. And so our participation in this is to demonstrate how we are addressing a segment of the market through innovation, through data-informed decisions, and trying to increase capacity, not just as a charitable nonprofit, but truly with collaborations with the public and private sector.
And what happens to these adults who don't have a parent to be a caregiver or a family member? How do they find housing?
Not easily. And that's,
No.
What we're experiencing. Consider this, there are about 159,000 individuals in Arizona living with autism and an intellectual developmental disability. That's about 3 times the size of the Diamondback Stadium. So that means about 1/3 of the individuals can get into the stadium, 2/3 are sitting in the parking lot, and the people inside the stadium aren't even in the right seats, because not everybody with autism, not everybody with an intellectual developmental disability needs the same thing. So again, we need a portfolio, and we need to also look at ways that we can integrate some people, and many people actually, in our communities and into housing when they have perhaps low and moderate support needs. People with higher support needs need something different. And to your point earlier, Gary, it is complex, but people are complex. And so that's the beauty of this collaboration, and why we all work together is to really unpack what we're talking about, and most importantly, who we're talking about when we talk about the housing crisis and people experiencing homelessness.
All right, Dax, can you weigh in on what you're doing?
Yeah. So we do a lot of development work in the Valley, and my particular passion is around workforce and affordable housing. Particularly, we have a new platform we're working on called the 5 Pillars. And when we were kind of looking at affordable housing, we kind of took a step back. And historically, everyone has approached affordable housing of how do you build cheaper housing? And that's kind of the problem statement they start with. We took a step back and said, well, what are we actually trying to solve with affordable housing? And when we got into it, we realized that this is not just a housing crisis. There's kind of a general affordability crisis that's rolling out across the state of Arizona. And we asked ourselves, well, how can we use housing as a lever to address this more general affordability crisis? And so we truly believe that a lot of poverty in the United States today comes from people not being able to save enough money. If you're able to save, suddenly when you get an unexpected medical bill, you get your car breaks down, you can absorb those costs better. Whereas people who have no savings, if your car breaks down and you don't have the $1,000 to fix it, you're now just without a car. And that has ripple effects throughout the household. And so we really looked at how can you increase savings rates of households. We looked at household budgets and found that there's really 5 main categories driving household expenses. And those are, housing is the biggest one, but it's also childcare, it's healthcare, it's transportation, it's food. And so we've started looking at developing communities rather than just developing housing projects. And so how do you bring a small nonprofit grocery store into the common area of the community? How do you bring healthcare and give residents an option for health insurance as part of their rent rather than just, getting it through their jobs? And then on top of that, putting a telehealth clinic on site that if their kid's sick in the morning, instead of missing a day of work, they can just run downstairs, take their kid to the clinic. And, there's other things we're doing. I won't kind of bore everybody, but, kind of multi-generational units so that you have support for childcare. We've partnered with different schools so that they have kind of preschools on site. And so we're really trying to address this problem more holistically to avoid people from having these crises that then lead to homelessness.
So it's more than just a set of walls and a roof.
That's our theory.
It's
Okay.
not just a theory though, Dax. I mean, we can look at the general market and see private sector developers getting a premium for how they build their integrated multi-generational communities that have all the kinds of supports and connectivity that you just described. And that's what we're looking for too. And how we do that together to really develop that integrated, inclusive type of community where people know their neighbors, people can be supported. I love this description of, how we live more independently and are supported. And it's about the people in your life you don't pay to care about you. And we think about all the people in your communities and other communities who care about their neighbor and check in on them. And, and that's community. That's what people value.
Yeah. And I think it's one of the biggest challenges as a developer. It's kind of the holy grail. If you can build community instead of just building walls, everybody wants to live there. You get tenants who stay longer, you get less turnover costs, but it's hard to do. Pulling those subtle structural levers so that you're not invasive and you're not doing something that kills your bank loan and the bank's still going to go for it, but at the same time making that happen, it's a challenge, but we're taking our crack at it. So we'll see how it goes.
All right. So Jim, are housing and homelessness interconnected? Because we're going to talk about homelessness today as well. And if they are, how so?
Yes, they are, but it's complicated. So what you just heard from Denise and Dax, it's absolutely correct. And just to elaborate on what Dax was talking about, there's a lot of things that impact an individual's ability to get proper housing. Part of it has to do with the affordability of the product itself, and part of it has to do with the income and financial stability of the individual. So when we talk about housing, we can't ignore talking about how can we increase individuals' academic achievement so they can make more money over time? How can we increase the financial status of those of lower income so that we don't have a recession that disproportionately impacts the poor? So talking about this in a holistic way is really the way to go forward. But in many cases, it's hard to have the private sector completely pick up the tab because the finances don't necessarily work all the time. And that's why you need a good partnership between the private sector and the public sector, philanthropists. But I've seen enough example programs where I feel like it could work, but we need to get everybody involved. And one way that we found success at doing that is we try to monetize things that you wouldn't think that you'd be able to monetize. And so, for example, on your question, Gary, about on homelessness, well, there's temporary homelessness that might have to do with temporary economic issues. There's homelessness that has to do with people that really need some medical help. We might have homelessness related to the elderly that don't have enough income. We have homelessness related to some military individuals. We have homelessness related to people that have some criminal justice backgrounds but didn't get that extra support when they exited the system. There's even really high levels of homelessness among foster kids that age out of the system. So when we deal with these things, we can talk about housing and homelessness, but when we break down the housing piece, the solution is going to be taking each piece separately and trying to fix each individual piece of it. So, let's say you have a car and there's different parts of it that are broken down. The first thing you don't do is just paint it. You fix the areas of the car so that it's usable. I feel like we need to do that in this case. And we had this problem with education for a while, where every year somebody would say, we need $1 billion. But there was more success when they said, we need $200 million for this program. And by the way, that extra level of academic achievement is going to generate $400 million within 8 years. It's a positive ROI. It's a good financial investment. So people that say, let's operate government like a business, the business would have made that investment, the government should. And on what Dax and Denise were talking about, it may be the same thing. We might have to start monetizing some of these types of projects and show that in the long run, We're not just spending money, we're investing in people, and we're going to be better off for it. And we don't have to be waiting 20 years. I mean, we could be better off within 2 or 3 years, and we could be helping people within a single year on individual programs.
You know, when you talk about that, Jim, it reminds me, because it is complicated and it does make a lot of sense. I like to think of it as a super highway. We have our philanthropic investors taking a lane and they're allowing us to be innovative. We have and that's also allowing us to learn what's working and for whom, and also what needs to work better. And then we've got a lane for the public sector and jumping in and providing some supports. And then, you know, the private sector needs some of that public support. They need to have this de-risked before they're going to really get going. And I like to think of ourselves in the charitable nonprofit lane and the HOV lane, because what we're trying to do is bring them all together to demonstrate what's possible so we can actually go farther, and using some of those principles that actually make sense for every single lane in terms of that ROI, you know, the economic benefits, the quality of life benefits, the benefits to the, you know, the community and economic impact. It really should work for everyone, but it is complicated, and we need to be able to unpack it. And we need people to be able to better understand it, which is, Gary, why we're glad to be part of this today, is to really help people understand some of these complexities and also what they can do to make the greatest impact.
That's important, Denise. I love that. I'm going to put a highway on one of my slides, have each lane be a different issue. But what I've also found is people are looking for solutions. We very rarely are asked, we have a great idea, we want you to work it out. Usually we have a concept, or do you have any ideas on how something could work if it has to be something that hasn't been done before? But what you're talking about is each of these lanes might have a very unique idea in a way, and getting back to like the economic financial perspective, we need almost a prospectus for each of these individual lanes to let people know these are worthwhile following up on. And then you can talk to leaders in the community, you can talk to lawmakers, the governor's office, the business community. But that's where I see a lot of really high quality projects, not necessarily in housing, but just across the board. Some great ideas that people have don't necessarily make it over the finish line because not enough time is put in to really explain and sell the issue. That's how you're not going to donate. You're not going to put $500,000 into a particular fund when somebody says, hey, I got a good idea. You're only going to consider doing that, one, if you had enough money to do it. Two, if they had one heck of a prospectus where you'd want to move all your finances over to that particular area. That's what we're asking policymakers to do. And so I think that's where, you know, you and Dax have a big leadership role in these areas, because you're the ones that put together these prospectus for people to consider.
And you mentioned that you have seen some you know, successful projects, and you know, we did an entire morning scoop, an entire hour on a housing project with the East Valley Institute of Technology, where they're going to house people who've aged out, or kids who have aged out of the foster care program. So you know, when it comes to housing, you know, what's working right now? What have you guys seen? What's, you know, the gem in the portfolio, so to speak?
I guess I can start. So just real briefly, from the economic perspective, I don't think we can spend our way out of this issue. I think we need to blend it with acknowledge that different housing problems are associated with different individuals, different groups of people, and we have to work on it that way. But we have to come up with some clever ideas. And so there's one bill at the legislature that has bipartisan support that has to do with reuse of some commercial property and convert it into housing in an easier way. I like that. One bill that didn't pass, in fact, it was my favorite, was to allow those decaying neighborhoods where you might have a large strip mall area at a particular intersection or even mid-mile. And we really could use a multifamily project there. The proposal was to freeze the property taxes in that area for a certain amount of time. So it'd be like a quasi-GIPLET type of a project, but that would give the developer that extra little bit of profit to make that complex work, and they would pay the lower taxes, and that would cost taxpayers nothing because they weren't going to be collecting much from that project anyways. So I think I think we'll have to spend some, we'll have to be very innovative. And again, you get back to changes in public policy, you'd be surprised what you could end up building just by removing some restrictions or providing a really solid idea out there, like this one that it doesn't look like it's going to be heard this year, but I'm hoping it might be considered next.
And I really like the community spaces that that developers are putting in DAX, like what you're talking about. We talk about, you know, hard infrastructure, we talk about soft infrastructure, and you have to have the hard infrastructure, you have to have the physical space so you can actually program it to provide the kinds of supports, the connectivity, and also the practice. You know, this being a good neighbor and civility, you know, we need a lot more practice in terms of how we get it right, how we better understand each other, and, you know, what the needs are, and how we work, you know, for local solutions. If the lights are out or there's, you know, some increased crime in the area, like what we do as community to solve our own problems. And we do need to practice that. We need more community spaces to allow neighbors to get together on that.
I'm afraid I'm kind of the pessimist of the group, it seems. I unfortunately I see a lot more that doesn't work than that's working right now. Someone asked about HUD. We work regularly with HUD. It's a very challenged program. The way they allocate money has a lot of strings attached to it. I don't know if anybody saw, but there was just a article, I want to say it was in the New York Times, about how LA developers are finding it cheaper to not use HUD than to use HUD. And it doubles your per door development cost to go with a HUD program. And so to put it in perspective, I had a deal 2-3 years ago where we were doing workforce housing that was about $174,000 a door. We killed it. That included land costs. It just got too expensive. To develop a HUD unit in Arizona today is almost $400,000 a door, sometimes above $400,000 a door. And so, you know, and it's all for good reasons, right? It's because we want them to be environmentally friendly, and we want them to be dignified, and we want them to have high ceilings, and, you know, all these things. But I think no one has taken a holistic look at what the additive effect of that is. And the additive effect is that we can do way fewer projects through HUD because that same amount of money, you know, can only cover 5 projects instead of 20 projects that year. And so I think it's really challenging. And then also you have kind of the challenges with HUD just in general. You know, I spent the past 11 months trying to get my audited financial statements submitted to their React system, because it took 11 months for them to get me a login and clear the flags internally in their system that were preventing my auditor from uploading our files. So the government programs are a challenge. I think kind of, Denise, to kind of one of your earlier comments, that's one of the challenges we're seeing across the board, right? Cooperation costs are real. Like, it's hard to cooperate against diverse groups, or I'm sorry, with diverse groups. And I think one of the challenges in bringing in the nonprofit sector has been that a lot of nonprofits fundamentally operate differently than business. And that causes sometimes some mistrust and some friction in the kind of leadership process and the team process. And so I think one of our keys to success has been developing deep relationships with our nonprofit partners outside of projects, so that when we get to projects, you know, that trust is already there, and we could say, hey guys, you know, I can't contract out all the ways this is going to work right now, but we got you. And you can just trust that, you know, we'll do our best, and it, you know, it's going to be a compromise at the end. I got 5 people asking me for control of the same area, but we're going to try to make something that works for everybody. I would call out, there are a couple projects that I think are doing really well. I mean, all the affordable housing developers are just moving mountains to try and solve this problem. Unfortunately, it just doesn't have enough scale with how far we are behind in our housing supply to really solve the issue. But I think, I don't know if anybody's familiar with Greenlight Communities, Rob Lyle and Pat Watts. they're doing workforce housing, and they're doing it in a totally market-driven way, which is giving them the scale to make a much bigger dent than 1 or 2 projects a year. And so I would call them out as people who are really, in my opinion, doing best practices and making a difference.
And I'd like to comment about Foundation for Senior Living, FSL. We co-developed 2 properties with them, and those integrate people with autism. And they were people who also received supports earlier in adult life and are now living more independently and engaged in the workforce. So again, small numbers, but those demonstrations of how we integrate housing and have developers who are wanting to integrate and be more diverse is a great benefit. Dax, I look forward to spending a little time with you after today.
Yeah,
Explore
absolutely.
what we might be able to do together.
Absolutely. We love it.
So Denise, how key is leverage, like funding wise, leadership wise, community wise, to addressing housing and homelessness?
Leverage is everything, because there's no one sector, there's no one lane that can do it all. In our case, again, with people with autism and intellectual developmental disabilities, you have this ever increasing population. You have huge demand. You have reduced supply and costs. And so we absolutely have to leverage. There's no one sector, to me, that can really do it all, because the solutions or the housing that has existed is not the housing that we necessarily need right now. And we need capacity. We need to be able to increase the number of units that we have. We need to be able to support people in different ways. So for us, it's all about tri-sector collaboration, and it is about that innovation, the likes of which I really do like, because of the community that's in place, the opportunities to use and develop property on schools, and additional land by the places of worship and the churches and the synagogues, and where community has already been developed. And I think those are great opportunities. And so the creativity also of people and leaders and organizations in their different lanes is really helpful, because they're close to the people. They know what they need to do in terms of the solutions. It has to make financial sense. There has to be an ROI, but we see far too many times, how public sector throws money at some of our problems, and at a rate that is far in excess of what the investment should have been in an actual solution. But you can't do it all at once, and there's staging that needs to happen, and that's what our participation is to try to create new models so that we can learn from those and then work with others to replicate and expand those for greater capacity.
That staging is going to be important. My best guess is that this is a 3-year effort at a minimum. I'm hoping that we can get some volume opportunities early on, and then we can expand it as needed and as there's support. We're going to have a different financial situation with the state this coming year versus in a couple of years. So if we can blend the ideas properly, when we need government dollars, there'll be an opportunity to get those. But like I mentioned before, there's so many opportunities where we score something as a cost, where it's going to be saving the state so much more money over time. If we can just change that thinking, maybe we can even shift some of the higher cost items up a little bit. But I feel like this will be a multi-year effort, like you're mentioning. It won't be an overnight solution.
And it's hard to think of multi-year. I know for all of us, when the crisis is upon us. And so it's having different groups focused on, again, what can we do now for that temporary, housing? What can we do down the road, on that workforce housing? Again, it can't happen fast enough, but we have to get out of a crisis mode all the time, because we're just putting Band-Aids on things that are really foundational, fundamental problems for our community.
And going back to what Jim just said, I mean, there's going to be less money for public-private partnerships over the next few years as well, right? Because of our state budget.
Yeah, here's where I differ with some of my colleagues at the Capitol when
Hmm.
there's a lot of discussion about whether or not the income tax cut caused the current problem. There was a lot of one-time money coming from the federal government that boosted all the states' revenues up, and a lot of permanent changes were made or ongoing spending, permanent tax cuts were made based on these temporary monies. But at the time when the tax cut was implemented, there were a number of organizations that we were working with that were involved. And one of the issues, in order to get consensus among some of the lawmakers that were holding out, was they wanted more money to be set aside in the rainy day fund. We have $1.5 billion in the rainy day fund right now. I would argue that 450 million of that was to solve problems that we're experiencing right now that were anticipated. We put a memo on our website that we call the Jerry Maguire memo that we distributed in the past, saying that the stuff that's happening right now is going to happen. We really need to have extra money in the rainy day fund. To get through a mild recession, which is what I think we're going to have, the state needs about $1 billion. You can do the math. So I feel like we can continue to invest in certain areas if lawmakers are willing to use some of those extra rainy day fund monies for the exact purpose that they were set aside. So I'm hoping that they'll be a little bit more flexible with how they treat that 1.5 billion, because honestly, some of the stuff that's happening, that was the only reason that the extra money was set aside. So we have more options than people are indicating. It's a matter of getting some policymakers to maybe want to tap into that a little bit, even if it's 100 million. We leave the other 350 million in there. You know what we could do with $100 million on some of these projects? Quite a bit.
Okay, thank you. So Dax, um, as a developer, how should we be developing, the home of the future? And how do you define that home?
Great question. Let me tackle it kind of in order. So I guess to me, and Denise has hit on this several times, if you look at how housing has been developed in the past, it's typically a one-size-fits-all solution. And so the only real segmentation that we've seen in housing has been on income up. If you make more money, you get a nicer apartment, but all the apartments typically have kind of the same amenities. They all have a pool, they all have kind of a weight room, they all have some of this stuff. And how nice that is depends on how much you pay in rent. Where I think we need to go is a more customized solution. And so different communities have very different needs. And so a pool may not be the amenity that really drives the most value for everyone. And okay, it gets complicated because someone asked a finance question, and I'm happy to go more into it. But one of the challenges is getting financing on any of these projects. And banks often have a checklist. And so they'll say, well, do you have a pool? And if you say no, they say, well, we can't give you a loan. But we need to kind of shift the system away from this one size fits all. This is a predetermined solution, and get to how do we create communities that serve specific communities, right? Like specific groups of people that have specific needs. And, to me, like when we look at our amenities on the 5 pillars, we're saying, okay, if I'm working 2 jobs and I have 2 kids at home, childcare is a much more impactful amenity for me than a nicer swimming pool is, or than even a weight room is. I probably working 2 jobs, don't have as much time as I'd like to work out. And if I do, I'm probably just hopping on a treadmill or something where my kids need a place to be, because otherwise they're going to be bouncing off the walls. And, so I think the answer to what the home of the future looks like is that it's a more specialized experience. It's more customized. When we talk about kind of what the home is, I think we can kind of work backwards from that to get to what does it mean to build a home from a developer standpoint. I'm sure there's a lot of great definitions out there from kind of a more humanist perspective. But to me, as a developer, the home is really the hub. And so when we really think about what are we building, okay, we're building, there's some table stakes, right? It's got to be safe. It's got to be protection from the elements. It's got to, we live in Arizona. It's got to have cooling. It's got to have some of this stuff. But more important than that is it's this central point in your life, right? You go from your house to your office or to your job or to the site, whatever it is. You go from your house to see your friends. You have your friends over. Like, it's this linchpin in all these interactions we have. And so how do you design it to serve as a more effective linchpin? How do you place homes near jobs, right? I think one of the challenges we're having, and Jim, I'd love to get your opinion on this, but a lot of these communities that consider themselves kind of high-end bedroom communities are really struggling right now. I work with a lot of school districts, and they're saying, hey, we can't keep support staff because they have to live on the salary we can afford to pay. They have to live in Maricopa. And that's now an hour drive to get to work every day. And as schools open up in Maricopa, why would they make that drive? They just go work in Maricopa. And so our admins, our janitors, our starting teachers, they're not wanting to live in some of these higher end communities anymore because they can't afford it. And so how do we,
That's so spot on. The issue with this is why I like that infill proposal so much, because it was going to allow housing to be in the areas where a lot of these individuals work. And I feel like there's a lot of good public policy ideas, and then there's a lot of ideas that might be community specific. Just reading about Sedona and whether or not there should be an allowance for people to sleep in their cars. To me, that is completely unacceptable to be in a situation like that, but they got hit with the short-term rentals disproportionately. And so there's limits on what they can do. Flagstaff, I went mountain biking up there with my son, and we just happened to spend part of a ride going through NAU. And the very first idea was they could use a lot more dorm rooms because they're very cheap. The developer pays for the cost, and then they charge the basically the rent. It's very low cost housing, and that would free up thousands and thousands of other units in the Flagstaff area that workers could then take. Simple solution that actually makes sense that the university wants, brought it up, went nowhere. So I 100% agree with you. Having that workforce housing, it adds to the cost of infrastructure. It adds to traffic congestion, but it's expensive. Lower income people are, if they're spending extra money on gas and on travel, then they have less money to spend on food and healthcare and support for their kids and a lot of other things that I know that you all look at.
well, and I'd argue that, yeah, maybe it impacts local traffic, but what causes more traffic? The entire workforce of Scottsdale driving in from Maricopa on the 101 every morning at the same time, or some people driving the 2 blocks from their apartment to their job. Like, I don't know, you got to kind of pick your poison on some of this stuff.
Well, you do, and we need a portfolio of solutions. We need a portfolio of opportunities, and what is that low-hanging fruit, Jim, and how we make, economic sense out of it. I was looking at the chat and some of the questions, and Tom Kelly, I always appreciate your input, and the return on investment here, and how we make economic sense for all the lanes on that highway, and how, John, you were asking about transitional housing for vets, and so often I think about other populations outside of those experiencing autism or intellectual and developmental disabilities, and I think that I often think about the Americans with Disabilities Act, 30 plus years ago. And you think about, for those of us who don't have mobility issues, we all benefit from those curb cuts in all kinds of ways. And there are curb cuts today, and some cognitive curb cuts and some other things that we can do that can benefit people with disabilities and people who are older and vets and many populations, and looking for those things that become our practice and that can benefit everyone, while also acknowledging the differences in terms of what people need and how they need to be delivered. And technology, Gary, you had asked about some innovations, bringing for people who need supportive housing, like those with disabilities, bringing those supports through technology into their home. And that, we are finding, can also reduce the cost of someone living more independently in their home. And those kinds of things are also being incubated thanks to philanthropy and some of our nonprofit charitable groups, in terms of experimenting with that and how can we get going in those areas. So, we need to we need to solve the crisis, but we can't do it all at once. And we also need to be more innovative because, you know, what we've done to get us here is not going to get us out of the current condition.
Jim, I wanted to ask you, and you've touched on some of the legislation so far, the reuse of the commercial property, you know, and, you know, of course, the casitas idea is supported by, you know, Governor Hobbs, and it's bipartisan. But is there any current legislation at the legislature to address, you know, like the multitude of issues related to housing and homelessness, you know, beyond just supply and demand? And
Well, after the governor's veto of the bill that was discussed earlier, the charge was, I want to sign something. I would like to see some additional coordination. I know that that's happening. We're fortunate enough to we work with the cities in a number of different ways, the state, but we also work with developers, and I understand where they're coming from. At any given time on our project schedule, we have at least one to two clients where they're having a hard time getting a multifamily project approved that's desperately needed. And we'll have to do an analysis and say, I appreciate you preserving that extra industrial land, but you realize you have 400 years worth of industrial land in your plan. You don't need it all. And here's a better space instead. But on the positive side, the cities often approve those projects after the economic analysis is done. I would actually like to see that part of our business go away, and figuring out a way for the cities to go through that process on their own and speed things up. But the cities are trying in those cases. So right now, I'm hoping that there'll be a couple of bills that are being considered. And like I mentioned, the one where you can reuse commercial property. I don't think we're going to see the one that I like the most, which was freezing the property rate. Some of the conservatives were helping to put a torpedo on the side of that one. But what I didn't understand at the time was that bill that would freeze the property taxes was going to cost the taxpayer nothing. It was going to be one of the most cost-effective ways of incentivizing tens of thousands of units in the valley at no cost to a taxpayer, yet it was rejected. To me, that just means we have to communicate better, and we have to show what if we just bought everybody a home, what it would cost versus us doing some public policy items. So I don't think there's going to be a bill where it's going to say we're going to do these 10 different things. Last year, there were a bunch that were considered and then they were collapsed. We did 3 different reports on it. Other people did reports on housing. But I'm hoping that each year, if we can at least make some progress, we'll get to where we want to be. And we won't be letting the economy dictate that housing will become more affordable, because we're not going to be creating jobs anymore.
And Jim, to that point, what we find, and this is also as a co-founder and proud board member of Home Matters to Arizona, is that the communication stops as soon as we say affordable housing. People have a visceral reaction, and it's not just in Arizona, it's across the country. And so what we've done with Valley Leadership and the county and several collaborators through the Home is Where It All Starts campaign is to give people language they can use so that the conversation can continue. Because who can debate that every Arizonan deserves a place to call home, or who can debate that we want affordable rents and mortgages? You know, so there are some simple things that we can do, we hope, to get the conversation going before it gets really complicated really fast. And that's important in terms of how we solve these, you know, these big issues before us.
all right, we've got about 10 minutes left, and I want to take a few questions from the audience. So first one is, you might have an idea of this, Jim. How many affordable housing units is Arizona short? I know we probably know how many in total we're short, but how about affordable?
Well, the question that typically comes up is, how many housing units are we short to make housing affordable? And there have been some numbers as high as 300,000. Ours was 60 to 80,000. Most people have revised their numbers down to about that, but it's not going to be as simple going forward. We went through a period where here's how it would normally work. Somebody that has a mid to higher price home, they're doing a little bit better, they're farther along in their career, would then buy a more expensive home, and the developer can afford that because the higher price homes have a higher profit. When you're dealing with low cost homes, the profit margin is very thin. That's why some of the very low income housing opportunities just don't get built. So you see people moving through the system, and that frees up some of the lower cost homes. If you lock yourself in on a mortgage around 3% versus moving up and then paying 7.5%, you just immediately lost about $100,000 on an average home in terms of what you could apply to your next, because that's the savings you have just with the lower mortgage rate. That's why interest rates are so important. We're going to see people holing up in their homes, and instead of moving up and freeing up some of the lower cost homes, they're just going to be making a lot of improvements. That's why I think we're going to see a lot more traffic at those home improvement stores, because if you are financially competent, you're going to be thinking about, I have this great interest rate. So that even though we had to do something in the economy to slow inflation, that did have a negative impact on the affordability, because while prices came down a little bit, the mortgage price went up far more than the home prices went down. And it's that monthly payment that matters, not necessarily the overall price of the home. So things got a little squirrely. Things will balance out in the long run, but we got to keep conveying this message. That's why I wanted to participate in this. And this is why I love to see that groups like with Denise and Dax and others are working on this, because we need more people. And I always like to say banging their fists on the podium down at the Capitol or in a city council meeting. We need more people fired up on this issue, because it is something where people should have access to affordable housing. I don't want to say it's a right, but I think it's our responsibility to try to make that as realistic as possible. But it makes economic sense as well. We have so many different arguments to support it. We just got to keep pushing that message. And I know that Denise is definitely somebody that's probably banged her fist on a few podiums. So I love that there's people like that working on this issue.
Can I tag on to that real quick, Gary? Yeah. I just noticed there was someone who had asked about why are so many apartments being built and how that impacts this issue. And I think, Jim, you're kind of speaking directly to that. I think the idea is that there's a huge housing deficit right now. And so the more units we can have, the better. Now, some of those units maybe are being built at a price point that is not where the need is really. But what that does is that tends to free up people who right now could afford those, but are eating up and driving up the price of the lower price supply, because there's a bidding war over the mid-priced units, particularly single family homes. And so by giving them another option, you alleviate some of the pressure that's driving up those prices. I don't know how, Jim, you and Denise feel, but I'm a firm believer, after looking at a lot of data on this, we are in a supply crisis, that one of the best ways out of this is increasing supply.
I completely agree. And, Jim, the numbers that you cited earlier, I think are actually conservative. I represent largely an invisible population, because, again, people with disabilities, autism, are living with their family members. They're not in those data points. And, a parent like me, gets sick or, passes, who's going to care about them? Where are they going to live? And those are some of the other numbers that are not yet accounted for in those stats that you cited. And Dax, I appreciate the contrast that we can offer, because I am the glass half full. I mean, I want to shine a bright light on what is working, and we need to do that, not just for the population I serve, but for all populations. People getting a home, people going back to work, people contributing, people being a good neighbor. It's like, how do we create that and model that and shine a bright light on it? So that's also what Home is Where It All Starts, and that campaign is all about.
Now, there's an issue that has to do with water. It's the build to rent homes. It's usually debated within the context of water, because they don't have to get the assurance of the water. But as far as, the housing and housing supply, what is build to rent doing to that? Is it a benefit? Is it, nothing more than, glorified apartments, or, what is that about? Jim, go ahead.
Go for it, Jim. No.
No, go ahead. Good.
I'd say nothing more than glorified apartments. I think kind of undermines the crisis that we're actually in. I mean, any units are really needed right now. And so, I've heard them call the horizontal apartments. If you can rent a place where you get a backyard and I love my apartment personally. I like the rental lifestyle, but, I just think that it's filling a key niche here and is part of the solution. And I'll let Jim talk about water, but.
Well, we probably could have a separate event on water. I'm optimistic that we keep talking about it, but I'm pessimistic that people actually understand some of the economics behind it. But we'll get there. There's some lawmakers wanting to see some of these new high water use businesses completely recycle their water. So there's different things that we can do on economic development and continuing with water a little bit. When Denise was mentioning she's a glass half full person, I am as well. My problem is I don't have a lot of faith in the person holding the pitcher that's going to fill the rest of it up for us, which is those that we have, those in office in many cases. That's why we got to keep pushing with the communication so that we're not just saying, I'd like to say, why isn't our glass full? That's where we have to get to eventually, but that's another challenge too.
All right, we're down to about 4 minutes left. So could each of you just take us out of here with a minute or two of just kind of sum up what we've been talking about and what you'd like to see going forward? I'll start with you, Dax.
Well, great. I think going forward, we need creative solutions and we need supply. I've been reading the comments and there were some great questions. I wish we had more time to get to, but some of the questions have centered around, can we legislate solutions to this? And I think one of the real challenges that doesn't get represented is we have to motivate people to solve this problem. And so as a developer, I'm constantly being approached with other investment opportunities that are competing for these development dollars. And I have a fiduciary duty to certain people by law that I have to put them in the best, investments possible and things like that. And so people are asking things about inclusionary zoning and about rent control and things like that. I think what you find from the development side is twofold. One is that development is a very risky business because most developers have to put up personal guarantees, which means if one project fails, they go bankrupt. They lose their house, their family, they may get divorced. It is a huge cost on them. And so we just need to be very careful about adding barriers and disincentivizing people from solving this problem, which is what some of these policies do long term. And so I think the flip side of that is kind of the positive side that these guys have been talking about, is how do we get more people playing? And by getting more people in the game, you get more creative solutions. You get things like the 5 pillars that we're trying to do. But if, on things like rent control, there's literally an Excel formula we use that tells us whether we invest in a project or not and whether we go forward. And things like rent control just make the Excel formula impossible to work. And so I deeply empathize. I had a 30% increase over a 2-year period on my rent. I deeply empathize with the rent increases that we've seen in Phoenix. But if I could leave us with one thing, I think the answer is supply. We need to build more. We need to get more units in the pipeline. Sorry, I think that was more than my 2 minutes.
Denise?
Yeah, I want to make sure that we make this crisis matter, that we actually put down some fundamental changes and the spirit of collaboration and the spirit of solutions, and recognizing that for those who are often underrepresented, underserved, they're also underestimated in terms of what they can and do contribute. So truly recognizing the portfolio of solutions that's needed, the portfolio of people and families that we're addressing, and how each of us can assume our lanes and also build something bigger than each of our interests. And that's going to be community, and that's leadership, and that's what we do look to our governor and our legislature and all sectors to help us lead with.
Thank you. Jim, take us out.
Sometimes you have to tell a good story. In fact, almost all the time, you have to tell a good story, and then you have to indicate what the opportunities are and the risks. We've gotten a lot of success when we just recently dealt with a project where we thought that it could reduce a particular county's rate of growth by 0.1%. So instead of growing by 2.8%, it would be 2.7. So we grew that out 20 years, and we ended up showing that public policy change was going to be costing about 50,000 jobs and hundreds of millions of dollars in tax revenue. That gives good perspective to policymakers when they see that scale. And then they realize maybe we need to do something to avoid that, because even tiny changes in economic growth add up over time. We call it compound economic development because it adds up over time. If we can tell the right stories, we can have the right prospectus documents for each of those lanes that Denise referenced. We look at the realistic situation, the financial issues related to what it takes to actually get some of these built that Dax was talking about. And we let people know how it might impact other things that they're working on. Then I think we can have a very solid story. And so I thought I really enjoyed participating in this panel because it was diverse, but there was a pretty common theme here.
All right, and that's it. And I just want to say thank you to our sponsors, Home Matters and Valley Leadership. I want to thank our panelists for joining us today, Denise Resnick, Jim Rounds, and Dax Howard. And of course, the audience for taking an hour out of your day. We had a good audience today, and they all stayed. So this was not, your typical housing homeless discussion. And I hope everybody, as Denise said at the top, hope everybody can take something away from this. So everybody have a good day, and we will see you soon. Thanks. Goodbye.
Have a good one, guys.
Thanks.